In the crisp autumn of 1989, the tranquil suburban neighborhood of Salem, Massachusetts, was devastated by the sudden disappearance of a young boy. He had vanished during the night, his father discovering the empty bed and open window at dawn. But 10 years later, his sister discovers an old cassette player hidden in their deceased grandmother's belongings. And when she presses play, she hears something that chills her to the bone, revealing a truth so horrifying it would uncover the most disturbing family secret imaginable. That crisp October afternoon in Salem, Massachusetts, Rebecca Walsh stood in what used to be her grandmother's cluttered attic, sorting through decades of accumulated memories. The house felt oppressive now, thick with dust and the weight of unspoken grief that had settled into every corner like a living thing. The estate was still in probate, but her uncle David had been designated as executor, making him temporary steward of the property and giving him responsibility for clearing out the contents. David knelt beside her, carefully wrapping china in newspaper, his movements precise and methodical, the way he approached everything since his troubled years following military service. They worked without much conversation, a strained rhythm they'd developed since Grandma Walsh's funeral 8 months ago. It had taken this long to finally tackle the overwhelming task of emptying the house. Even death couldn't ease the tension that had plagued their family since Tommy disappeared 10 years ago. The silence between them carried the weight of a decade's worth of unanswered questions. "This box is ready," Rebecca said, pushing a container toward him. It held their grandmother's romance novels, reading glasses, and the small transistor radio she'd listened to during her final bedridden months, always tuned to the local news station as if she might hear some word about Tommy. David lifted the box easily, his carpenter's shoulders still strong at 38. After losing his construction job in late 1987, he'd enlisted for military service, completed a 6-month stateside posting before being medically discharged due to a back injury, then returned to live with Rebecca's family starting in mid-1988. The years had been kind to him physically, though Rebecca noticed new lines around his eyes, a weariness that seemed to have settled into his bones. "I'll take this one downstairs," he said, heading for the narrow attic stairs. Rebecca sealed another box with packing tape, the sound sharp in the dusty air. She tried not to think about how this house had become a museum of painful memories, each room frozen in time like a shrine to everything they'd lost. They'd all tried to maintain normal family relationships after Tommy vanished, but grief had carved different wounds in different people. Her father, Robert, had retreated into his workshop in the garage, spending endless hours crafting birdhouses and jewelry boxes with an obsessive precision that spoke to his need for control in a world that had proven utterly chaotic. Her mother, Linda, had thrown herself into volunteer work with missing children organizations, working 12-hour days until exhaustion silenced the questions that tormented her during quiet moments. The arguments had started small: whose turn to cook dinner, why the lawn wasn't mowed, whether to leave Tommy's bedroom unchanged. But everyone knew what festered beneath the surface: blame, guilt, the terrible weight of not knowing whether their boy was alive somewhere, suffering, or if death had mercifully ended whatever nightmare had taken him from his bed that October night. 8 months ago, their grandmother had finally passed away at 91, taking with her the last vestige of family unity that had somehow survived the decade of searching and waiting. Margaret Walsh had been the glue that held them together through the darkest times, insisting on family dinners, holiday celebrations, birthday parties that honored Tommy's memory while acknowledging that life had to continue. David returned, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The October afternoon was crisp, but their exertion in the stifling attic was exhausting work, especially in the confined space that seemed to trap heat like an oven. "That's most of the heavy stuff," he said, his voice slightly breathless. "Just a few more boxes and we can call it a day. I promised your parents I'd have this sorted by the weekend." "I want to check behind the wardrobe," Rebecca said quietly, gesturing toward the massive oak piece that had dominated one corner of the attic for as long as she could remember. Grandma always hid things back there: important papers, Christmas presents, things she didn't want us kids to find. David's face remained carefully neutral, but Rebecca caught a flicker of something: anxiety, before he nodded. "Of course. I'll finish with these boxes and start loading the car." He picked up another container, giving her space to explore. Rebecca approached the wardrobe, its dark wood gleaming even in the dim attic light. Every creak of the floorboards brought back childhood memories of playing hide-and-seek with Tommy in this very space, their grandmother's voice calling out warnings to be careful of the old furniture and dusty corners. She squeezed behind the wardrobe, using her phone's flashlight to illuminate the narrow gap between the furniture and the slanted roofline. Dust motes danced in the LED beam like tiny ghosts, and spider webs caught the light in delicate patterns that suggested this space hadn't been disturbed in years. Tucked far back against the wall, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, her fingers found a small wooden box she'd never seen before. Rebecca pulled it free, surprised by its weight and the care with which it had been constructed. The box was simple but well made, crafted from cherry wood with her grandmother's initials carved into the lid, M.W., for Margaret Walsh. The brass hinges were tarnished but still functional, and when Rebecca lifted the lid, she found the interior lined with faded blue velvet. Inside, beneath layers of yellowed tissue paper, she discovered a treasure trove of items she'd never seen before. Photographs from her grandmother's youth, letters tied with ribbon that had once been white but had aged to cream, a small jewelry box containing what looked like antique earrings, and at the bottom, wrapped in a soft cloth, she found a small red cassette recorder. It wasn't the expensive Sony model Tommy had wanted for his 6th birthday, the one they'd seen advertised on television with all the professional features. This was a basic drugstore version, the kind sold in the electronics aisle next to batteries and phone cords. They'd been saving for new siding that year, after a harsh winter had damaged the house's exterior, and every dollar had been spoken for. The compromise had seemed reasonable at the time. Tommy got his recording device, just not the top-of-the-line model he'd coveted. He'd been disappointed initially, but had thrown himself into using it with the enthusiasm that characterized everything he did. Rebecca lifted the device, checking the battery compartment. Surprisingly, the batteries looked relatively fresh, not the corroded mess she'd expected from a decade-old electronic device. Her grandmother had always been meticulous about maintaining her electronics, changing batteries before they leaked, keeping instruction manuals in a neat file folder. She pressed the play button, expecting nothing but static or silence. Instead, the speakers crackled to life and a small voice emerged, clear and heartbreakingly familiar. Testing, testing. This is Thomas Michael Walsh, and I'm 6 years old. And today is... There was a pause, the sound of rustling papers. Today is October 12th, 1989. Rebecca's heart stopped. She hadn't heard her brother's voice in 10 years. The sound hit her like a physical blow, bringing tears that seemed to spring from some deep well of grief she'd thought had finally dried up. She marveled at how clear the recording was. The batteries were dated 1998 on the wrapper, her grandmother's last Christmas replacement before her memory started failing. Tommy's voice continued, bright and animated as he chattered about his day at school, his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, the Halloween costume he was planning. "I'm going to be a dinosaur," he announced proudly. "Not just any dinosaur, but a Tyrannosaurus Rex, because they're the biggest and strongest, and Jenny Morrison said girls can't be dinosaurs, but I think that's stupid because dinosaurs don't care if you're a boy or a girl." Rebecca smiled through her tears. Tommy had always been fiercely protective of fairness, quick to defend anyone he thought was being treated unfairly. It was one of the things that had made his disappearance so particularly cruel. He'd been a child who believed in goodness, in the basic decency of the world around him. The recording continued with typical 6-year-old randomness. Descriptions of the fort he was building in the backyard with David's help, excitement about a field trip to the science museum, a detailed account of finding a particularly interesting beetle near the garden. Then the recording shifted. Background noises became more prominent. Movement, the sound of footsteps, a door closing. A man's voice entered the recording, distant but unmistakably her Uncle David. "Tommy, come to the special room when you're ready. Remember what I promised? Once we're finished playing our game, we'll go to Toys R Us for that new GI Joe set you wanted." Rebecca frowned, rewinding the tape to listen again. Special room? She'd lived in her parents' house for 18 years before moving out for college, and she'd never heard any room referred to as special. And Tommy hadn't been particularly interested in GI Joe figures. His obsessions had been dinosaurs, construction vehicles, and nature documentaries. What could this special room be? And why would David promise toys that Tommy didn't even want? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Maybe David had been trying to redirect Tommy's interests toward more traditionally masculine toys. Uncles sometimes did that. thinking they knew better than parents about what boys should like. The promised G.I. Joe set could have been David's attempt to steer Tommy away from what he might have seen as childish fascinations. Rebecca searched through the box but found no military toys, no evidence of the promised Toys R Us trip. Perhaps they were stored elsewhere, or maybe David had kept them after. She couldn't finish the thought, couldn't let her mind travel down that dark path without more evidence. She rewound the tape and played it again, listening intently to every word, every inflection. David's tone was different from his usual warm, unclely manner, coaxing, almost wheedling, with an undertone she couldn't quite identify. There was something practiced about it, as if he'd said these words before, many times. Special room. The phrase echoed in her mind as she sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by the remnants of her grandmother's long life. What room in their house could David have been referring to? The basement workshop where he'd spent so much time during the months he'd lived with them while job hunting? One of the upstairs bedrooms? After all, David had been practically living with them in the months before Tommy's disappearance. But what Rebecca was now realizing with growing unease was that David had also spent considerable time at their grandmother's house during that same period. Grandma Walsh had been struggling with her hip surgery recovery, and David had often stayed overnight to help with maintenance and care, giving him access to the basement workshop space he'd set up there, as well as his temporary room at Rebecca's parents' house. Everyone had thought it was wonderful that Tommy had such a positive male role model so present in his life. David had been patient with Tommy's endless questions, had helped him build that backyard fort, had taken him on adventures to the woods behind their neighborhood. He'd been the fun uncle, the one who had time for games and stories when parents were busy with adult responsibilities. Rebecca set the recorder aside and continued examining the box's contents more carefully. The photographs were revelations, images of her grandmother as a young woman, beautiful and vibrant in ways Rebecca had never imagined. Letters from her grandfather during World War II, written in the careful handwriting of a man who'd learned to write before typewriters were common. Hours seemed to pass as she sorted through the collection, each item a window into a version of her grandmother she'd never known. When she opened a manila envelope expecting to find more letters, she realized something crucial was missing. Tommy's original missing person file wasn't there. She distinctly remembered her grandmother keeping a thick folder of newspaper clippings, police reports, and official documents related to the investigation. As a teenager, Rebecca had paged through it once during a particularly difficult anniversary, seeing her grandmother's careful annotations and growing collection of evidence. But now there was no sign of it in this carefully curated collection of her grandmother's most precious possessions. The old grandfather clock downstairs chimed 6 times, its deep tone carrying through the house like a funeral bell. David would be expecting her for dinner. They'd planned to order pizza and continue packing tomorrow. Without those documents, she couldn't piece together the full timeline of Tommy's disappearance, couldn't refresh her memory of details that had faded over the years. She gathered the cassette recorder and the wooden box, handling both with the reverence due to sacred objects. As she prepared to leave the attic, something else caught her eye. A small scrap of paper that had fallen from the envelope, so thin and yellowed it had nearly disintegrated. In her grandmother's careful handwriting, she could make out a partial note. David's story doesn't match. October 14th said he was at job interview until 8 p.m., but Mary Peterson saw his truck at house around 6. Why would he lie about? The note ended abruptly, as if it had been torn or the writer had been interrupted. Rebecca's blood turned cold. October 14th. 2 days after the recording on October 12th, 1 day before Tommy disappeared on October 15th. Her grandmother had been keeping track of inconsistencies in David's alibi, had noticed details that didn't add up. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket alongside the cassette recorder. Whatever her grandmother had discovered, she'd hidden the evidence carefully, perhaps waiting for the right moment to reveal what she knew, or perhaps afraid of the consequences of accusing her own son of the unthinkable. Downstairs, she found David in the kitchen, already on the phone with the pizza place. His voice was cheerful, relaxed, the same uncle who'd helped her with math homework and taught her to ride a bicycle. But now Rebecca found herself studying his every gesture, looking for signs of the deception her grandmother had apparently uncovered. "I couldn't find that missing person file," she said after he hung up, trying to keep her voice casual. "I thought Grandma kept all the newspaper clippings and police reports in a big folder." "Oh." David paused, and Rebecca caught the slightest hesitation before he answered. She gave those to me years ago. Said they were too painful to keep around, stirring up old memories every time she saw them. His explanation came smoothly, but there was something rehearsed about it, as if he'd been preparing for this question. "Could I see them tonight?" Rebecca asked, studying his face carefully. "I'd like to review everything again now that I'm older. Maybe I'll notice something we missed when I was just a kid." David's smile seemed forced, not quite reaching his eyes. "I don't think that's a good idea, Becca. You've been through enough emotional turmoil lately with Grandma's passing. Why put yourself through all that pain again?" "I need to see them," Rebecca insisted, her grip tightening on the cassette recorder hidden in her jacket pocket. "Please, it's important to me." David checked his watch with what seemed like relief. "Actually, I just remembered. I have my grief counseling session tonight. Tuesday evenings, you know. It's been really helpful, working through all the family trauma with a professional." Something about his tone bothered Rebecca deeply. In 10 years of knowing David as her uncle, through holidays and family gatherings and the long aftermath of Tommy's disappearance, she'd never heard him mention therapy or counseling. He'd always been the strong one, the family member who held everyone else together during the crisis, who organized search parties and dealt with police when her parents were too distraught to function. When had he started seeing a counselor? And why had he never mentioned it before today, when it provided such a convenient excuse to avoid her questions? "What's the counselor's name?" Rebecca asked, trying to sound casually interested. "Maybe Mom and Dad would benefit from talking to someone too." "Dr. Reynolds," David replied quickly, "but I don't think he's taking new patients right now. Very busy practice." He moved toward the door with obvious eagerness to leave. "Pizza should be here in about 20 minutes. Just pay the delivery guy and we'll settle up tomorrow." "Maybe I could come with you sometime," Rebecca pressed. "Family therapy might help all of us process Tommy's disappearance better." David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flash of something, panic, before he regained his composure. "The group is pretty established. New members would disrupt the dynamic we've built up, maybe sometime in the future." As they waited for the pizza, Rebecca found herself studying her uncle with new eyes. The cassette recorder felt heavy in her pocket, Tommy's innocent voice echoing in her memory, alongside David's strange invitation to a special room. Her grandmother's note about inconsistencies in his alibi burned like a coal in her other pocket. She was probably overthinking everything. Grief did that to people, made them suspicious of shadows, desperate for answers in places where none existed. Families kept secrets for all kinds of reasons, most of them harmless. Maybe David really had started therapy and just felt private about it. Maybe the missing person file really was too painful for their grandmother to keep. But the coincidences were piling up in ways that made her stomach churn with growing unease. The pizza arrived 20 minutes later, providing a welcome distraction from the tension that had been building between them. They ate in their grandmother's dining room, surrounded by boxes and the lingering scent of her lavender perfume, trying to maintain normal conversation about family memories and plans for settling the estate. David seemed more relaxed as they ate, sharing stories about their grandmother's stubborn insistence on doing her own gardening until she was 85, her legendary Christmas cookies that took 3 days to make properly, her habit of hiding money in old coffee cans throughout the house. "She never gave up hope about Tommy," David said quietly, taking a sip of his soda. "Even at the very end, when her mind was going, she'd ask me if there were any new leads from the police." Rebecca nodded, remembering those final visits to the nursing home. Their grandmother's eyes had remained sharp even when her body was failing, always scanning Rebecca's face for any sign that news about Tommy might be forthcoming. She kept his bedroom exactly the same for years. "Mom finally had to pack it up when we moved to the smaller house. That wasn't healthy," David said, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge that surprised Rebecca. "At some point, people need to accept reality and move on with their lives. Keeping shrines to the dead doesn't bring them back." The comment stung more than Rebecca expected. "He might not be dead," she said quietly. "We never found a body. There's still a chance." "After 10 years?" David interrupted, his tone sharp with impatience. "Becca, you need to face facts. Tommy is gone. Whatever happened to him that night, he's not coming back. The sooner everyone accepts that, the sooner this family can heal and move forward." The conviction in his voice was unsettling. After a decade of hope and searching, David seemed absolutely certain that Tommy was dead, not missing, not taken, but definitively dead. It was the kind of certainty that usually came from knowledge, not assumption. "How can you be so sure?" Rebecca asked, studying his face carefully. David finished his pizza before answering, taking time to wipe his hands and mouth with deliberate precision. "Because I'm realistic. Because I've seen what false hope does to families. Your parents have wasted 10 years of their lives chasing ghosts instead of grieving properly and rebuilding." After dinner, David gathered his jacket and keys with obvious eagerness to leave. "I should head out for my appointment. Lock up when you're finished here, okay? And try not to stay too late. This house gets creepy after dark." Rebecca watched through the window as his truck pulled away, taillights disappearing into the October evening. Once she was certain he was gone, she climbed back to the attic with the cassette recorder, determined to listen to the entire tape without interruption. This time she heard things she'd missed before. The recording contained hours of material, capturing not just Tommy's deliberate attempts to make a tape diary, but conversations and background noise from throughout their house. Her 6-year-old brother had apparently left the device running for long periods, creating an inadvertent surveillance record of their family's daily life. Most of it was innocent: their mother calling them for dinner, their father watching television in the living room, normal household sounds that painted a picture of a typical suburban family. But scattered throughout were more concerning segments that made Rebecca's skin crawl with growing horror. David's voice, always in the background at first, gradually becoming more prominent as the recordings progressed. "Tommy, want to see something special in the basement workshop? Don't tell Mom and Dad about our games. They wouldn't understand. This is just between us, buddy. Our secret." The progression was clear once Rebecca knew what to listen for. David had been grooming Tommy, building a relationship of special trust and shared secrets. The promises of toys, the exclusive attention, the emphasis on keeping their interactions private from his parents. It was a textbook pattern of predatory behavior. The basement. Rebecca realized with growing horror that David must have been referring to this very basement, their grandmother's basement, where he'd spent so much time during his stays helping with her care. After Tommy's disappearance, when David had moved out of her parents' house, he'd continued visiting their grandmother regularly, always offering to help with maintenance projects in her basement workshop area. She remembered how proud he'd been of his workshop, how he'd insisted on privacy while working, claiming he wanted to surprise the family with his creations. Her parents had respected his need for space, grateful for his help around the house and his positive influence on Tommy. Now, Rebecca wondered what had really been happening in that basement during all those private hours. She grabbed her grandmother's heavy-duty flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed for the basement door. The knob turned easily in her hand, but when she tried to push the door open, it didn't budge. A closer examination revealed a heavy deadbolt lock that had been installed above the original doorknob, a serious security measure that seemed excessive for a basement door. That was definitely new. The lock looked like something you'd install on an exterior door, designed to keep intruders out or, Rebecca realized with growing dread, to keep someone in. She searched through her grandmother's keyring until she found one that fit the deadbolt. The lock turned with a grinding sound, as if it hadn't been opened in a very long time. As the door swung open, stale air rushed up from the basement, carrying an odor that made Rebecca's stomach turn. It wasn't just the expected smell of a closed basement, dampness and dust and old concrete. There was something else, something organic and unpleasant that spoke of things long hidden and slowly decaying. Her flashlight beam swept down the wooden steps as she descended carefully, each creak of the old boards echoing in the confined space. The basement was larger than she remembered, extending under most of the house's footprint. Her light revealed the expected washing machine and dryer, boxes of holiday decorations, her grandfather's old workbench that had been covered with a tarp for years. Everything looked normal at first glance. Then her light caught something in the far corner that made her heart stop. A section of the concrete wall that didn't match the rest. The color was slightly different, the texture not quite right, as if it had been patched or repaired sometime after the original foundation was poured. And in front of this suspicious wall section sat a large wooden chest that Rebecca had never seen before. The chest was old but well maintained, made from what looked like oak with heavy brass hinges that had been polished to a dull shine. It was substantial enough to hold significant contents, and something about it radiated an aura of secrecy that made Rebecca's hands shake as she approached. The chest wasn't locked. When she lifted the heavy lid, the hinges creaked in protest. Inside, she found things that made her stomach turn and her mind reel with the implications. Children's clothing in various sizes, from toddler to young teen, all carefully folded and preserved. The items were clean but clearly used, and Rebecca recognized some of them. A striped shirt that had been Tommy's favorite, a small pink dress that she remembered Jenny Morrison wearing to church, toys that had never been played with, still in their original packaging, board games and action figures and art supplies, as if someone had been stockpiling gifts for children who would never receive them. The smell was stronger here, rising from deeper in the chest. Photographs, dozens of them, possibly hundreds, arranged in careful chronological order. Rebecca's hands trembled as she lifted the first few from the stack. They showed children she didn't recognize, posed in ways that made her skin crawl with revulsion and fury. But as she dug deeper, she found photos that stopped her heart completely. Tommy, her 6-year-old brother, in that very basement, sometimes alone, sometimes with David. The images were more disturbing than anything she could have imagined, documenting abuse that had clearly been going on for months before Tommy's disappearance. The dates written on the backs of the photos told the story in stark detail. They began in July 1989, just a few weeks after David had moved in with their family, and continued right up until October 15th, the night before Tommy disappeared. At the bottom of the chest, beneath the photos and toys and clothing, Rebecca found a thick manila folder labeled in David's careful handwriting, Tommy's Special Lessons. Inside were detailed notes, written in David's hand, documenting what he called training sessions with Tommy. The language was clinical, detached, as if he were recording the progress of a laboratory experiment, rather than describing the systematic abuse of a 6-year-old child. The final entry was dated October 15, 1989. Subject becoming resistant. Threatened to tell parents about games. Termination necessary to protect program. Will proceed tonight after family asleep. Other subjects already identified. Rebecca dropped the folder as if it had burst into flames. Her phone trembled in her hands as she dialed 911, her voice coming out in a whisper when the dispatcher answered. "I need police at 47 Elm Street immediately. I've found evidence of child abuse and murder. I know what happened to my brother." The police arrived within minutes. First patrol cars with flashing lights, then detectives and crime scene technicians in what seemed like half the Salem Police Department. Rebecca stood in the front yard, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm evening, watching as they carried evidence box after evidence box from the basement. Detective Sarah Chen, she'd changed her name after marrying, Rebecca remembered, sat with Rebecca on the front porch steps as the crime scene team worked. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes that had clearly seen too much, and she handled Rebecca's statement with a gentleness that suggested extensive experience with traumatized families. "Rebecca, I need you to understand what we're dealing with here," Detective Chen said carefully. "These photographs and documents suggest your brother was being systematically abused before he disappeared. The evidence points to something much worse than a simple missing person case." "The wall," Rebecca said numbly, pointing toward the basement. "The new concrete in the corner, it doesn't match the rest." Chen nodded grimly. "We've already called for ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. We'll have answers soon." She paused, studying Rebecca's face. "We've also put out an arrest warrant for your uncle. Do you have any idea where he might be?" As if summoned by her words, David's truck turned into the driveway, headlights sweeping across the cluster of police cars like a spotlight revealing a stage play. He parked slowly, methodically, then stepped out and stood beside his truck for a long moment, taking in the scene with what looked like resignation rather than surprise. Then he walked calmly toward the house, hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. "I know why you're here," he said simply, his voice carrying across the yard with eerie calm. Detective Chen stood and signaled to the uniformed officers. "David Walsh, you're under arrest for the suspected murder of Thomas Walsh and multiple counts of child abuse." As she read him his rights, David's expression remained unnaturally composed, as if he'd been expecting this moment for 10 years. Before they loaded him into the patrol car, David looked directly at Rebecca with eyes that held no remorse, no shame, only a cold satisfaction that chilled her to the bone. "I loved him more than anyone," he said, his voice conversational, almost friendly. "I gave him special attention more than your parents ever did. He was happy with me until he started listening to other people about what was normal and what wasn't." Rebecca felt bile rise in her throat. "Where is he? What did you do to Tommy?" David's expression didn't change, didn't show even a flicker of human emotion. "He's exactly where he belongs. He's been safe for 10 years. safe from people who would have filled his head with lies about our special relationship. Detective Chen stepped forward. That's enough. Get him in the car. The cryptic answer was somehow more terrifying than any detailed confession could have been. As the patrol car pulled away with David in the back seat, Rebecca realized that even with his arrest, the nightmare was far from over. Finding Tommy's body would bring closure, but it would also confirm the worst fears that had haunted their family for a decade. The next morning, ground-penetrating radar revealed multiple anomalies beneath the suspicious concrete section. By afternoon, investigators had broken through the floor with jackhammers and found what Rebecca had dreaded: the skeletal remains of a small child, along with the dinosaur print pajamas Tommy had been wearing the night he disappeared. The medical examiner later confirmed what everyone suspected. Tommy had died on the night of October 15, 1989, exactly 10 years ago to the day. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, suggesting he'd been killed quickly, possibly when he tried to resist or threatened to expose what David had been doing to him. But Tommy wasn't the only victim. As investigators continued excavating the basement, they found 2 more sets of remains. Children who'd gone missing from the Salem area over the previous years. Cases that had never been connected because they'd happened months apart, in different neighborhoods, involving families who didn't know each other. The Morrison girl Rebecca had remembered was among them. Little Jenny Morrison, who'd gone missing 3 years before Tommy. Her remains were found wrapped in the same careful manner, confirming that David's crimes had been ongoing for years before Tommy became his final victim in this location. The investigation eventually revealed the full scope. David's detailed records documented 12 cases across multiple states, but physical evidence confirmed 23 murders over 2 decades. Additionally, investigators identified 8 living survivors, now adults, who came forward with their testimonies of abuse. The basement in Salem had been just one of several locations David had used during his long career of predation. In his full confession, given with the same eerie calm he'd displayed during his arrest, David revealed the entire scope of his crimes. He'd been targeting and abusing children for over 15 years, moving from place to place when suspicion began to mount, always finding families who trusted him, who welcomed his help with their children. The timeline made horrific sense now. David had started his pattern in other towns, other states, before eventually coming home to Salem when he lost his construction job. Living with Rebecca's family had given him unprecedented access to Tommy, but it had also been his downfall, staying in one place too long, becoming too attached to one victim, keeping too much evidence. Tommy had been special, he explained to the horrified detectives. Living in the same house had given David unprecedented access and opportunity. He'd been able to groom Tommy slowly, carefully, building the kind of relationship that could have continued for years if Tommy hadn't started showing signs of resistance. The special room had been David's workshop, soundproofed and equipped with everything he needed for his crimes. The cassette recorder had been his idea. He'd given it to Tommy as a gift, encouraging him to record his thoughts and experiences. What Tommy hadn't known was that David had been using the recordings to monitor his mental state, to gauge how successful the grooming process was. When Tommy began expressing doubts, when he started asking questions about whether their games were normal, David had made the decision to silence him permanently. He'd killed Tommy in the basement that night, then buried his body beneath a concrete floor he poured himself the next day. The open window in Tommy's bedroom had been David's misdirection, designed to make it look like an abduction by a stranger. He'd even participated in the search efforts, comforting the family while knowing exactly where Tommy was buried. The investigation uncovered additional victims, children David had abused but not killed, now adults who came forward with their own stories of trauma. The scope of his crimes was staggering, spanning multiple states and involving dozens of children over the course of 2 decades. Rebecca's grandmother, they learned, had started to piece together the truth in her final years. The hidden box in the attic contained not just the cassette recorder, but notes and observations that showed she'd been conducting her own investigation. She'd noticed inconsistencies in David's stories, had connected his presence to periods when local children went missing, but she'd been old, uncertain, afraid of making accusations that could destroy her family if she was wrong. She'd hidden the evidence, perhaps hoping someone else would find it and draw the conclusions she'd been too frightened to voice. Detective Chen explained this to Rebecca during one of their many meetings in the weeks following David's arrest. "Your grandmother was protecting you," she said gently. She knew something was wrong, but she also knew that David was dangerous. She left you a trail of breadcrumbs, hoping you'd be able to see what she couldn't say out loud. The trial was a media sensation. David's crimes were so extensive, so carefully documented in his own writings, that there was no question of his guilt. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but even that seemed inadequate, given the scope of the suffering he'd caused. Rebecca attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row with her parents, who had aged a decade in the months since Tommy's body was found. Her father had thrown himself into victims' rights advocacy, while her mother had started a foundation to help families of missing children navigate the criminal justice system. During his victim impact statement, Rebecca's father looked directly at David and said simply, "You stole our son's life, but you also stole 10 years of our lives. You made us doubt ourselves, doubt each other, doubt everything we thought we knew about keeping our children safe. That's a theft that can never be repaid." David showed no emotion during any of the proceedings. He sat calmly through testimony about his crimes, through the reading of his own notes documenting the abuse, through the tearful statements of his victims' families. The only time he showed any reaction was when the prosecution played portions of Tommy's cassette recordings. As Tommy's innocent voice filled the courtroom, talking about his plans for Halloween and his excitement about the science museum field trip he'd never take, David closed his eyes and smiled slightly, as if remembering something pleasant. That expression, captured by news cameras and broadcast across the country, became the defining image of the case, a reminder that monsters don't always look monstrous, that evil can wear familiar faces and speak words of love while planning unspeakable acts. Rebecca stood in Salem's Green Lawn Cemetery 6 months after the trial ended, finally able to visit a real grave instead of the empty memorial marker that had stood there for 10 years. The new headstone was simple: Thomas Michael Walsh, beloved son and brother, 1983-1989. The words "finally home" were engraved beneath his name. The investigation had prompted a review of other cold cases throughout New England, leading to the identification of several more victims and the closure of cases that had puzzled investigators for years. David's methodical documentation of his crimes, combined with the evidence he'd hoarded in various locations, had provided a roadmap to 23 confirmed murders across multiple states, but it had also given families the answers they'd been seeking. The estate sale of the grandmother's house was delayed pending the completion of the investigation. When the property was finally sold to a new family months later, the basement was completely renovated, and the house's dark history was disclosed to the buyers. They chose to purchase it anyway, believing that love and light could reclaim any space from darkness. As Rebecca placed fresh dinosaur figurines on Tommy's grave, a tradition she'd begun after his body was finally laid to rest, she thought about the innocent voice on that cassette tape. Her brother had been trying to document his life, to capture his thoughts and experiences in a way that would preserve them for the future. He'd had no idea that his recordings would eventually become the key to solving his own murder, that his childish excitement about school and friends and Halloween costumes would provide the evidence needed to bring his killer to justice. Tommy's voice had been silenced forever that October night in 1989, but in the end, he had testified against his killer from beyond the grave. Rebecca walked away from the cemetery feeling something she hadn't experienced in a decade: peace. Not the false peace of denial or the exhausted peace of giving up hope, but the genuine peace that comes from truth, finally emerging from darkness. The cassette recorder sat on her kitchen counter now, silent but somehow still powerful. She'd listened to it dozens of times during the investigation, helping police identify every voice, every background sound, every detail that might provide additional evidence. But she hadn't played it since the trial ended. Some things were too sacred to revisit casually. Her parents had asked if she wanted to bury the recorder with Tommy, but Rebecca had refused. It belonged in the world of the living, a reminder that truth has a way of surfacing even when buried beneath years of lies and carefully constructed facades. The morning after her cemetery visit, Rebecca was making coffee when her phone rang. Detective Chen's name appeared on the caller ID, which still made Rebecca's heart race even months after David's conviction. "Rebecca, I have some news you should know about. David was found dead in his cell this morning." Rebecca set down her coffee mug carefully, processing the information. How? Apparent suicide. He'd been on suicide watch for the first few months, but his behavior had been so compliant that they'd moved him to general population. Guards found him this morning. The news should have brought satisfaction, Rebecca thought, but instead she felt only a hollow emptiness. David's death meant that the full truth about his other victims might die with him. There were still missing children cases that investigators suspected he was involved in. Families who would never get the closure that Rebecca's family had finally found. Was there a note? Rebecca asked. Yes, actually. That's why I'm calling. He left specific instructions that it be given to you. The note arrived by police courier that afternoon. Rebecca stared at the sealed envelope for nearly an hour before opening it. David's handwriting was as neat and methodical as everything else about him had been. Rebecca, it began, I know you think I'm a monster, and maybe you're right, but I want you to understand something about Tommy that nobody else will tell you. He was special, not just to me, but genuinely special. He was kind and trusting and pure in a way that most children aren't. In those final weeks when he started to resist our games, when he began asking questions about whether what we were doing was normal, I could see him changing. The world was already starting to corrupt him, to fill his head with shame and confusion about love and affection. I didn't kill him in anger. I killed him to preserve that purity, to keep him from becoming just another damaged adult carrying trauma and pain. In my basement, he was safe. He was loved. He was exactly what he was supposed to be. I know you'll never forgive me, and I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I want you to know that every moment Tommy spent with me, right up until the end, he was treasured. I gave him more focused attention and genuine care than most children ever receive from their distracted, busy parents. The other children, some of them fought me. Some of them cried and begged and made me feel like the monster you think I am. But Tommy trusted me completely, right up until those final moments. That trust was a gift, even if you can't see it that way. I'm ending my life now because prison holds no purpose for me. I accomplished what I set out to do. I had years of perfect love with perfect children, and no amount of punishment can take those memories away from me. Tell your parents that Tommy's last words were about them. He asked if they would be proud of him for being so good during our games. Even at the end, he was thinking about making the people he loved happy. That's who your brother was. Not a victim, but a child so full of love that he wanted to please everyone, even someone who was hurting him. I hope that brings you some comfort. The note was signed simply David, with no additional sentiment or apology. Rebecca read it 3 times before calling Detective Chen back. I want this destroyed, she said when the detective answered. I don't want my parents to ever see it. Are you sure? Sometimes families find closure in understanding. No, Rebecca's voice was firm. David doesn't get to rewrite history just because he's dead. He doesn't get to turn child abuse into some twisted love story. Tommy was a victim, and David was a predator. That's the truth, and that's how it stays. She hung up and immediately called her parents. Her father answered on the second ring. Dad, David is dead. Suicide in prison. I wanted you to hear it from me before you saw it on the news. There was a long pause. How do you feel about it? Her father asked finally. Empty, Rebecca said honestly. I thought I'd feel something more, but I just feel empty. That's normal, her father said. Justice isn't about revenge, it's about truth. We got the truth, and that's what matters. After hanging up, Rebecca went to her kitchen and pulled out the cassette recorder. For the first time since the trial, she pressed play and listened to her brother's voice. This is Thomas Michael Walsh, and I'm 6 years old, and today is October 12th, 1989. But this time, instead of focusing on the sinister undercurrents and David's voice in the background, she listened to Tommy himself. His excitement about school, his plans for Halloween, his detailed description of the fort he was building, his pure joy in simply being alive and 6 years old, and full of plans for the future. That was who Tommy had been. Not David's special child or perfect victim, but a normal little boy who loved dinosaurs and science museums and making his parents proud. David had stolen his life, but he hadn't been able to steal that essential Tomminess that shone through in every word on the recording. Rebecca played the tape until Tommy's voice gave way to static, then rewound it and played it again. She would never listen to it the same way again. Instead of evidence of horror, it had become a celebration of a life cut short, but not diminished. 3 months later, Rebecca received a call from Detective Chen with news about the continuing investigation. We've identified another victim, Chen said, a girl who went missing in Vermont in 1987, 2 years before David moved in with your family. His records helped us match the case. Is she dead? Yes. But her family has been looking for answers for 12 years. Your decision to preserve that cassette recorder and pursue the truth about Tommy, it's given 31 families closure they never thought they'd get. 23 families of murder victims, plus 8 survivors who finally got validation that their memories were real and their abuser will never hurt anyone again. After hanging up, Rebecca understood something fundamental about justice and truth. Tommy's voice on that cassette had done more than solve his own murder. It had given other families the same gift of truth that had finally allowed Rebecca's family to heal. Evil might hide behind familiar faces and speak words of love while planning unspeakable acts, but truth has a persistence that outlasts deception. Voices silenced by violence can still testify years later if someone is brave enough to listen, really listen, to what they're trying to say. Rebecca kept the cassette recorder on her kitchen counter, not as a shrine to trauma, but as a reminder that love, real, protective love, never stops searching for answers. It breaks down false walls built by lies. It refuses to accept comfortable fiction when uncomfortable truth is available. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very persistent, it brings the lost ones home. In Salem, Massachusetts, in a house that had harbored unspeakable secrets, the truth had finally set everyone free. The basement workshop where David had committed his crimes was sealed, and the house eventually sold to a family who knew its history, but chose love over fear. But Tommy's voice lived on, a testament to the power of innocence to overcome evil, even from beyond the grave. Rebecca visited his real grave every month now, bringing dinosaur figurines and updates about the other families who'd found closure through his unwitting testimony. She told him about the foundation their parents had started, about the new legislation requiring background checks for adults who spent extended time with children, about all the ways his brief life continued to make a difference. "You're still helping people, Tommy," she whispered to the headstone. "You're still the kindest, bravest little boy I ever knew." The October wind carried her words across the cemetery, where other families tended other graves, where other stories of love and loss played out under the New England sky. But for the first time in 10 years, Rebecca felt certain that Tommy could hear her. His voice had been silenced, but his story would continue forever, a reminder that even the darkest secrets can't survive the persistent light of truth, and that love, real love, always finds a way to bring the lost ones home. The cassette had been old technology even in 1989, soon to be replaced by CD players and digital devices that would make magnetic tape seem quaint and outdated. But that simple red recorder had preserved something more valuable than any modern technology could capture: the pure essence of a child's voice, speaking truth across the years with a power that no amount of evil could diminish. In the end, that was Tommy's greatest victory over the man who'd stolen his life. David had tried to silence him permanently, but Tommy's words had outlived his killer, had spoken from beyond death with a clarity that no living testimony could match. Justice had prevailed. But more importantly, love had prevailed. The kind of love that never gives up, never stops searching, never accepts that some truths are too terrible to uncover. Rebecca walked away from the cemetery that day, knowing that her family's long nightmare was truly over. They had their answers, they had their justice, and most importantly, they had Tommy back where he belonged. Not in some twisted fantasy of David's creation, but in their hearts and memories, exactly as he had been. A 6-year-old boy who loved dinosaurs and believed in the fundamental goodness of the world around him. That belief had been betrayed in the most horrible way possible, but it had also been vindicated. Tommy's trust in the power of truth to prevail had proven stronger than David's faith in the security of buried secrets. The recording device that had captured his voice sat silent now in Rebecca's kitchen, its purpose fulfilled. But the echo of Tommy's words would carry forward, a testament to the unbreakable bond between siblings, the relentless pursuit of truth, and the ultimate triumph of love over evil. In Salem, Massachusetts, where witch trials had once demonstrated how fear and superstition could corrupt justice, a different kind of trial had shown how patient investigation and unwavering love could restore it. The past could not be changed, but the truth had finally set everyone free. Tommy was home at last,